I am Harrison Blake, 70 years old, and as I sat in the dim, quiet solitude of my corner office on the 44th floor of Blake Holdings, I was trying to come to terms with the silence that marks the passage of 7 decades. Outside the floor-to-ceiling glass windows, the sprawling metropolis stretched toward the horizon, a glittering tapestry of steel, concrete, and neon lights that I had spent 40 grueling years helping to shape and build. The clock on my heavy mahogany desk showed 6 o'clock on a Tuesday evening. It was not just an ordinary corporate Tuesday, it was my 70th birthday. Yet, the executive suite was entirely devoid of celebration, echoing only with the low, steady hum of the climate control system and the distant, muffled wail of sirens far down on the city streets. I leaned back in my high-backed leather chair, staring at the brass phone receiver resting on the polished wood. At 70, a man expects his life to reflect the legacy he has cultivated. You expect the warmth of family around you, the lively chatter of a dinner table, and the quiet satisfaction of knowing your bloodline is secure and united. Instead, I had empty hallways and the weight of an empire on my aging shoulders. My wife had passed away over a decade ago, leaving our only son, Derek, as my sole surviving link to family. At 36 years old, Derek sat just down the hall in the executive vice president's suite, holding a title and an office I had practically handed him on a velvet cushion. Reaching forward, I lifted the receiver and dialed Derek's direct extension. The line trilled 3 times through the quiet office before the click of the connection chimed in my ear. Immediately, I could hear the faint, manufactured shuffling of papers in the background, the deliberate, practiced noise of a corporate executive trying to project an aura of frantic, overwhelming productivity. "Derek," I said, keeping my voice light and warm, deliberately hiding any trace of loneliness. "I know it is late and the office is starting to clear out, but I was thinking we could head down to Prime Steakhouse on 5th Avenue tonight. Grab a bone-in ribeye, maybe split a decent bottle of vintage scotch. It is my 70th, after all. I think we have earned a quiet celebration, just the 2 of us." A heavy, exaggerated sigh came crackling through the receiver. It was not the sigh of a grown man speaking respectfully to his father and chief executive. It was the sharp, put-upon exhalation of a sullen teenager being asked to take out the trash during his favorite television show. "Dad, I am so sorry," Derek said, his tone dripping with manufactured exhaustion and theatrical regret. "I am absolutely buried alive here right now. The city planning office just kicked back our preliminary zoning permits for the new West Side commercial development lot. The regulators are demanding a complete overhaul of the spatial allocation charts. I am going to be stuck here at my desk, staring at blueprints and legal binders until midnight at the earliest. There is simply no way I can leave the building tonight. I am trapped." I closed my eyes for a brief moment, feeling a familiar, hollow ache settle deep inside my chest, a quiet, aching disappointment that only a parent whose love is consistently taken for granted can truly understand. And yet, right alongside that sharp sting of rejection, a surge of misguided, protective pride rose up within me. I had built this commercial real estate empire from absolute scratch with my own bare hands. In the bitter, freezing autumn of 1984, when I was 32 years old, I had slept curled up in the unheated cab of a rusting, beaten-up Ford pickup truck parked on a muddy construction site because I could not afford both apartment rent and payroll for my 3 laborers. I remembered shivering in the dark, eating cold canned beans with a plastic spoon by the dim beam of a battery-powered flashlight, studying municipal zoning laws and complex construction contracts until my eyes burned and my vision blurred. I remembered washing my face in the icy, grease-stained sink of a 24-hour gas station before walking into bank after bank in a cheap, stiff suit, begging skeptical loan officers to take a financial chance on my first small commercial project. I had poured 40 years of my sweat, my blood, and my youth into the foundation of Blake Holdings for one singular, overriding reason, so that my son would never have to know what physical hunger or bone-chilling desperation felt like. If Derek was sitting in his office after hours, sacrificing his evening to protect our corporate permits and secure our family legacy, I could not possibly fault him for it. In my blinded parental affection, I believed his dedication was a reflection of my own lifelong work ethic. "I understand completely, son," I replied smoothly, swallowing the bitter lump of disappointment in my throat and forcing my voice to remain encouraging. The business must always come first. We cannot afford any regulatory delays on the West Side parcel. We have to keep those permits moving through the municipal pipeline. Do not burn yourself out staring at those blueprints all night, though. We will reschedule our dinner and celebrate properly next week when the paperwork is cleared. Thanks, Dad. You are the best, Derek said, his voice instantly brightening with a practiced, effortless charm. I will make this up to you, I promise. Happy birthday. Have a good evening. The line went dead with a sharp click. I sat alone in the silence of my darkening study for several long minutes, holding the dead receiver before setting it gently back into its cradle. 70 years old. It truly is a strange and surreal milestone. You look at the framed blueprints and the hard hats adorning the shelves, the crystal awards, and the multi-million-dollar deal tombstones, and you realize that all the financial liquidity in the world cannot purchase genuine filial devotion. I decided right then that I was not going to eat a microwave meal or sit alone in my empty residential estate on my 70th birthday. I stood up from my desk, shrugged into my heavy wool overcoat, and took the private executive elevator directly down to the underground parking garage. As my sedan glided out onto the bustling downtown avenues, surrounded by the vibrant energy of the evening theater crowd and the gleaming headlights of city traffic, my mind drifted back through the decades of Derek's childhood. Robert blinked, his welcoming smile wavering slightly as he sensed the sudden shift in my demeanor. "Why, your family, Mr. Blake," he said, gesturing discreetly toward the raised VIP section at the far center of the dining room. "Your son, Derek, arrived about 30 minutes ago with his guests. We placed them at the center VIP booth, exactly as he requested when he made the reservation this afternoon. We assumed you would be arriving shortly after." A cold, paralyzing chill washed over my entire body, a sharp, sudden drop in internal temperature that had nothing to do with the draft from the entrance doors. It was the visceral, terrifying sensation of your foundational reality fracturing beneath your feet. I did not ask Robert to lead the way, nor did I utter another word to him. I simply gave a short, stiff nod and began walking slowly through the bustling dining room on my own. Every single step across the thick Persian runners and polished hardwood floor felt heavier than the last, as if gravity itself were pulling at my bones. I navigated around crisp, white-aproned waiters, balancing heavy silver serving trays, and past tables filled with laughing couples and celebratory gatherings. As I neared the decorative marble pillars separating the main floor from the elevated VIP booths, I heard it above the smooth saxophone notes of the jazz band. It was a loud, booming, unmistakable laugh. It was Derek. I stopped just behind the edge of a wide, fluted pillar and peered through the warm ambient shadows toward the center VIP booth. What I saw in that exact moment permanently destroyed whatever lingering illusions of paternal trust I still held in my heart. My son was not buried under a mountain of municipal zoning permits. He was not trapped at his desk on the 44th floor, staring at complicated architectural blueprints or legal binders. He was sitting lounging back in a plush, tufted leather booth, wearing a perfectly tailored Italian suit, with his collar stylishly unbuttoned, looking healthier, happier, and more thoroughly relaxed than I had seen him look during business hours in 6 months. Sitting directly beside him, her arm laced familiarly, through his and her head resting against his shoulder, was his wife, Monica. She looked radiant, holding a crystal flute bubbling with expensive pale gold vintage champagne. And sitting squarely across the table from them, holding the entire booth hostage with her loud voice and animated hand gestures, was Patricia, Monica's mother. Patricia was a woman who consistently bathed in suffocating layers of heavy, sweet perfume and carried herself with the haughty, condescending arrogance of old aristocracy, despite the fact that she had never worked a single productive day in her adult life. From the moment Derek had foolishly married Monica 5 years ago, Patricia had viewed a commercial real estate empire as her own personal family inheritance, a bottomless financial well waiting to be tapped. She constantly dropped passive-aggressive remarks at holiday dinners about how conservative I was with my corporate liquidity, dropping heavy hints that a truly loving patriarch would purchase his son a 15-bedroom estate in the Hamptons or finance his mother-in-law's annual private yacht tours across the Mediterranean. I had always ignored her petty, grasping comments choosing to preserve domestic peace rather than engage in arguments with a woman who understood nothing of hard work. Seeing her sitting in that booth tonight, however, made the blood in my veins turn to liquid fire. They were not just dining, they were indulging in an extravagant, gluttonous feast. Arranged in the center of the pristine white linen tablecloth were three massive, multi-tiered seafood towers. The crushed ice glistened under the chandelier light, piled high with dozens of freshly shucked oysters, giant Alaskan king crab legs, chilled jumbo shrimp, and thick, sweet lobster tails. Two open bottles of top-tier vintage champagne rested inside sweating silver buckets at the edge of the booth, surrounded by crystal dishes of imported beluga caviar and artisanal blinis. I watched with mounting revulsion as Patricia meticulously used a silver fork to dig a thick chunk of meat out of a lobster claw, chewing with her mouth half open, while laughing at something Derek had just said. Monica, too, was revealing a side of her personality that she had carefully concealed from me for half a decade. Whenever she visited my home or attended corporate functions, she played the role of the demure, respectful, sweet-voiced daughter-in-law, always listening intently to my stories and expressing profound gratitude for our family blessings. But right now, leaning against my son in that VIP booth, her eyes were sharp, calculating, and entirely dismissive. There was an arrogant, triumphant glint in her gaze as she swirled her champagne. I stood frozen behind the marble pillar, completely paralyzed by the sheer, breathtaking audacity of the deception. My son had looked at his office phone less than 45 minutes ago, seen his father calling on his 70th birthday, and had chosen to spin an intricate, detailed lie about zoning regulators and midnight workloads just so he could slip away to drink expensive champagne and gorge on king crab with his grasping mother-in-law. "Oh, Derek, darling, you really are far too good to us," Patricia proclaimed loudly, her voice easily slicing through the restaurant's ambient music as she waved her diamond-ringed hand in the air. "This steakhouse is simply magnificent, and on a Tuesday evening, no less. Only the absolute best for my girls. You certainly know how to treat a family properly." Derek smiled comfortably, raising his crystal flute across the table to clink it against hers with a sharp ring. "We all deserve a proper break, Patricia. The office has been exhausting lately, and I wanted to make sure you had a memorable evening while you are visiting the city." Monica giggled softly, taking a delicate sip of her champagne before leaning closer to her husband's ear. "Are you absolutely certain your dad isn't going to notice that you slipped out of the building early? You know how obsessive and paranoid he gets about his precious schedules and operational reports." I held my breath in the shadows behind the pillar, my fists clenching so tightly inside my overcoat pockets that my nails dug into my palms. I waited, desperate to hear my son defend me, waiting for him to show even a single shred of loyalty or basic human respect for the father who had paid for the tailored suit on his back, the luxury watch on his wrist, and the roof over his head. Derek simply scoffed, rolling his eyes dramatically as he set his champagne flute down next to a plate of oyster shells. "Please relax, Monica. My dad is an absolute clueless old man at this point. He is so completely obsessed with improving his golf swing and planning his retirement schedule that he has no idea what is actually happening outside his own office doors anymore." He swallowed that fabricated excuse about the city planning zoning permits without a second thought. He bought every single word of it. He is completely out of the loop. The three of them burst into another round of loud, unrestrained, mocking laughter. It was a cruel, ugly, grating sound that struck me harder than any physical blow could have. In that singular, defining instant, the hollow sorrow in my chest completely evaporated. The parental grief that had weighed me down all evening was instantly burned away, replaced by a razor-sharp, freezing clarity that sharpened my senses to a lethal edge. I had spent 40 years surviving in the most cutthroat, unforgiving commercial real estate market on the planet. I had gone toe-to-toe with ruthless corporate sharks, aggressive hedge fund predators, and treacherous business partners who would slit your throat for a percentage point. I knew exactly what a parasite looked like when I saw one. Yet, I had never expected to find three of them sitting together in a luxury VIP booth, feasting on my money and treating my perceived senility as a hilarious punchline. I did not turn around to walk out of the restaurant in wounded silence. I did not retreat to my dark estate to weep over a broken family. With slow, deliberate precision, I unbuttoned my wool overcoat and stepped out from behind the decorative marble pillar into the bright, warm ambient light of the elevated dining area. The soft jazz continued to play from the hidden speakers, and the surrounding tables continued their lively chatter, but inside my mind, the only sound that existed was the heavy, rhythmic thud of my leather shoes striking the polished hardwood floor as I walked directly toward the center VIP booth. They were about to learn, in the most humiliating manner imaginable, that this clueless old man was the master architect who had designed and built the golden cage they were sitting inside. I took my first step away from the shadows surrounding the decorative pillars, and instantly, the soft saxophone notes drifting from the restaurant's hidden speakers seemed to fade entirely into the background. In their place was only the steady, measured thud of my leather shoes striking the polished hardwood floor. I did not rush or shorten my stride. A man who has spent 40 years navigating the treacherous, high-stakes waters of commercial real estate acquisitions understands the intrinsic psychological value of pacing. You never run toward a crisis or a confrontation. You walk toward it with deliberate, unhurried authority, owning every single square inch of the space you occupy. As I approached the center VIP booth, the trio remained completely oblivious to my approaching presence. Patricia was holding court at the center of the table, waving a silver oyster fork through the air to punctuate some self-aggrandizing story, her manicured fingers catching the light with diamond bands that my son's executive salary had undoubtedly funded. Monica was tossing her head back in delicate laughter, her perfect hair catching the warm amber glow of the chandeliers. And Derek, my own flesh and blood, the boy I had carried on my shoulders across construction sites and built an empire to protect, sat lounging back against the tufted leather with a smug, relaxed grin on his face as he poured another glass of pale gold vintage champagne for his mother-in-law. I stopped exactly 2 feet from the edge of their table. I uttered no greeting. I simply stood tall and let my broad shadow fall directly across the pristine white linen tablecloth, blocking the light cast by the table lamp right over Patricia's plate. Derek was the very first to notice the sudden darkness. The smug smile froze instantly on his face, his eyes widening in sheer, unadulterated terror as if a specter had just materialized from the floorboards. The crystal champagne flute in his right hand tipped dangerously, spilling several drops of the expensive golden liquid onto the tailored cuff of his shirt. He choked sharply on his intake of breath, his throat seizing. Monica followed his horrified gaze upward, her musical laughter cut off so abruptly and violently that it sounded as though she had been physically gagged. Her spine stiffened, pressing her shoulders hard against the tufted leather booth as her wide, panicked eyes darted frantically between my stoic face and her husband's trembling hands. Patricia was the last to realize that their private celebration had been breached. She slowly lowered her silver oyster fork, her mouth still hanging half open around a bite of food. The arrogant, condescending glint that usually dominated her eyes vanished in a heartbeat, replaced by a stunned, wide-eyed stare. For 10 agonizing, stretched seconds, absolutely nobody at the table dared to breathe, let alone speak. The surrounding booths and tables continued their lively, echoing chatter, entirely unaware of the silent, freezing storm that had just descended upon the center VIP section. "Dad," Derek finally managed to whisper. His voice was incredibly small and fragile, entirely stripped of the bravado and condescension he had displayed just moments earlier when mocking my age. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing visibly above his unbuttoned collar. What are you doing here?" "It is my 70th birthday, Derek," I said, my voice steady, calm, and completely devoid of parental warmth. "I decided to treat myself to a good steak tonight. Since you told me over the phone less than an hour ago that you were buried alive under a mountain of municipal zoning permits on the 44th floor, I naturally figured I would be dining alone. Imagine my profound surprise to walk into this dining room and find my hard-working vice president right here, throwing a banquet in the middle of the floor." The frantic lie tumbled out of his mouth before his conscious brain could even evaluate the absurdity of it. It was the desperate, reflexive deflection of a cornered thief, terrified of being exposed. "Dad, wait, please, it is not what it looks like." Derek stammered, leaning forward and raising his hands defensively. We are entertaining a critical client tonight. Patricia has a close personal friend who is a major architectural consultant in the city. She is just helping me pitch some preliminary design ideas and spatial concepts for the new West Side commercial development lot. I was gathering the notes to present the entire portfolio to you first thing tomorrow morning. I swear, we are working. I slowly lowered my gaze, letting my cold eyes sweep deliberately across every inch of the white linen tablecloth. There were no architectural blueprints anywhere to be seen. There were no legal pads, no site survey charts, and no preliminary sketches. There was only a towering, gluttonous monument of cracked king crab legs, empty oyster shells, half-eaten caviar blinis, and sweating buckets of imported French champagne. That specific realization was the key that unlocked the entire puzzle, turning my stomach into a hard, unforgiving knot of iron. Derek truly believed that I was blind, because I had voluntarily stepped back over the last 2 years to allow him room to manage the daily operational flow of Blake Holdings. He had convinced himself that I had lost my edge and become a toothless figurehead. If he felt comfortable and secure enough to swipe a high-limit corporate credit card for a public, lavish banquet with his in-laws, knowing full well that our internal accounting department processed and reconciled every single corporate receipt every Friday afternoon, it meant only one thing. He was no longer afraid of accounting oversight, because he had already systematically compromised or circumvented the internal audit controls entirely. A man does not begin his criminal career by publicly swiping a corporate card for a $3,000 dinner in front of an audience. He starts small, he tests the perimeter fences, he pushes through minor personal expenses, observes the reaction, and checks the alarm circuits. Only when he is entirely certain that the security cameras are disconnected and the guards are asleep does he grow bold enough to throw a lavish celebration in the middle of Manhattan using company funds. I looked around the dark study at the framed architectural elevations of my first commercial high-rise projects and at the worn, yellow plastic hard hat resting on the shelf, the very hat I had worn while pouring concrete in 1984. I had spent 40 years constructing an impenetrable financial fortress to ensure that no external competitor or hostile entity could ever steal a single brick from my legacy. Now I realized with chilling certainty that the thief was already inside the walls, carrying the keys to the master vault. I did not sleep a single second that night. I sat wide awake in the darkness of my study, watching the shadows stretch and shift across the Persian rugs as the early morning hours ticked slowly past. I systematically traced the lineage of Derek's professional behavior over the past 24 months, the sudden, unannounced closed-door meetings with third-party contractors whom I had never personally vetted, the repeated instances where I had asked to review our quarterly expenditure ledgers, only for Derek to brush me off with charming apologies, claiming he was still consolidating the regional numbers for a cleaner presentation. I had blindly, foolishly given him the benefit of the doubt every single time. I had allowed the tender pride of a father to completely override and suppress the razor-sharp survival instincts of a veteran chief executive. By the time the first pale rays of morning light breached the eastern horizon, painting the sky above the city in bruised shades of gray and orange, every lingering drop of paternal grief within me had been incinerated. What remained in its place was a singular, unbreakable, cold-blooded resolve. I stood up from my chair, my joints stiff from the sleepless night, and walked across to the desk. I picked up my cell phone and checked the display. It was exactly 6 o'clock in the morning, far too early for the corporate world to begin stirring, but precisely the right time for the man I desperately needed to contact. I dialed the private cell phone number of Gregory Pierce. Gregory was the senior corporate legal counsel for Blake Holdings, a brilliant, ruthless, razor-sharp attorney who had stood shoulder to shoulder with me during the most vicious, bloody corporate takeover battles of the late 90s. He was not just a lawyer. He was a strategic confidant who understood the anatomy of our company as intimately as I did. He picked up on the second ring, his voice crisp, clear, and instantly alert. Gregory knew that if Harrison Blake was calling his personal cell before dawn, the sky was falling. I placed both of my hands flat against the polished mahogany, bracing myself against the table. "Stop prefacing it, Gregory. Give me the unvarnished numbers. Tell me exactly what my vice president has been doing behind my back. Gregory opened the top folder of the audit stack with clinical precision. He did not look at me with sympathy. He looked at me with the cold, objective focus of a forensic investigator laying out evidence of a major crime. He slid a stapled, highly detailed summary spreadsheet directly across the wood to my side of the desk. I want you to look at the line items on this master authorization summary, Gregory instructed, pointing his pen at the rows of figures. The $3,500 dinner receipt from Prime Steakhouse, the catalyst that prompted you to order this shadow auditus, listed right at the very bottom of the last page. When you compare it to the overall expenditure volume across his executive accounts over the past 12 months, that steak dinner is literally a rounding error. It is pocket change. I leaned forward, my eyes scanning the dense rows of numbers, dates, and authorization codes. My breathing slowed to a steady, rhythmic pace as the sheer scale of the financial hemorrhaging became visible before my eyes. Over the last 12 months alone, Gregory said, his voice dropping to a hard, steady register, Derek has personally approved, signed off on, and expedited exactly $842 in independent consulting, architectural, and design fees. Every single one of these massive, recurring disbursements has been systematically funneled out of Blake Holdings and wired directly into the accounts of a single third-party vendor, an external corporate entity called Lumina Design. I picked up the summary spreadsheet, frowning deeply, as I stared at the vendor title printed across the top of the ledger. Lumina Design? The name means absolutely nothing to me, Gregory. In the high-stakes, multi-million-dollar commercial real estate sector of our city, you know every single major player by heart. You know the prestigious structural engineering consultants, the elite architectural design firms, the environmental impact analysts, and the top-tier municipal zoning strategists. Over 40 years, I had personally cultivated relationships, dined with, and negotiated contracts with the managing partners of every legitimate design and engineering house on the East Coast. Lumina Design was a total ghost. It did not exist within the professional universe of commercial development. Hand me the master vendor file, I instructed. I pulled the master certificate of incorporation and the primary bank account signatory cards half an hour before I walked up here. Gregory said softly, "Look at the name listed as the sole registered owner and primary shareholder of the shell company." I opened the thin folder and stared down at the legal registration form. Printed clearly across the top of the document, listed as the president, treasurer, and sole incorporator of Lumina Design LLC, was a name, Arthur Pendleton. I looked up at Gregory, my brow furrowing in confusion once more. Arthur Pendleton? Who on earth is Arthur Pendleton? I have never heard that name in my life. Gregory anticipated my exact question, his expression grim and unrelenting. Arthur Pendleton is not an architect, Harrison. He is not a commercial interior designer, nor is he an environmental consultant. He is a 64-year-old retired used car salesman living in a modest two-bedroom condominium in Wilmington, Delaware. Gregory paused, letting his eyes lock on mine with devastating intensity before delivering the final piece of the puzzle. More importantly, Gregory added, his voice dropping to a dark, quiet register, Arthur Pendleton is Patricia's first cousin. The revelation struck the room with the force of a thunderclap. The disparate, confusing puzzle pieces slammed together with blinding, violent clarity. My son was not just paying an unknown shell company to embezzle money for himself. He was actively, systematically funneling hundreds of thousands of dollars of my corporate capital directly into the pockets of his mother-in-law's family. Look at the secondary banking routing flow on the second page, Gregory continued, tapping the document with his finger. The money does not sit in Arthur Pendleton's Wilmington account for more than 48 hours. As soon as Blake Holdings wires the $80,000 monthly fee to Lumina Design, Pendleton takes a tiny 2% administrative cut for himself, and the entire remaining balance is immediately wired out to a private offshore trust account registered in the Cayman Islands under a holding company called PM Family Assets. From that offshore trust, the funds are continuously accessed via international debit instruments to finance an ultra-luxury lifestyle right here in the city. I sat back slowly in my leather armchair, staring blindly down at the Delaware corporate registration documents bearing Arthur Pendleton's name. For one fleeting fragile moment, a profound wave of paternal sorrow washed over my heart. My mind instinctively drifted across the room to the framed photograph on my bookshelf, a snapshot of Derek at 10 years old, dressed in his dusty Little League baseball uniform, sprinting across the field toward me with a wide, missing-tooth grin after hitting his very first home run. I closed my eyes and wondered, with bitter, aching bewilderment, where that innocent boy had gone. How had his soul mutated over the decades into the grasping, greedy, moral vacuum sitting in the office down the hall? Had my wealth acted as a slow-acting poison in his veins, or had Patricia and Monica simply poured fertilizer onto a dark seed of entitlement that had already been waiting inside his heart from birth? That moment of sorrow lasted less than 10 seconds. It was rapidly swallowed whole and burned away by a rising titanic wave of absolute, uncompromising protective fury. I had not spent 40 years fighting off hostile corporate takeovers, surviving brutal national recessions, and crushing aggressive competitors just to allow my own flesh and blood to dismantle my life's work from the inside and hand the pieces to his mother-in-law. If Derek wanted to play the role of a cutthroat corporate predator within the walls of Blake Holdings, I would treat him like one without a single drop of parental mercy. I reached across the polished mahogany desk and picked up the heavy brass telephone receiver. My hand was completely steady. There was not even a millimeter of tremor in my fingers. I looked straight across at Gregory Pierce, my jaw set like iron. "We are ending this criminal farce right here, right now, Gregory," I commanded, my voice vibrating with absolute authority. "I want you to pick up your cell phone and call your senior contacts at the Federal Bureau of Investigation immediately. I want federal white-collar financial crime agents walking through the front double doors of our lobby within the hour. I want Derek handcuffed right in the middle of the 44th floor, paraded down the executive hallway in front of every director and clerk in this building, and thrown into the back of a federal cruiser. Freeze his personal checking accounts, seize the Lumina Design corporate assets, and file formal criminal indictments for grand theft, corporate embezzlement, and wire fraud before 5 o'clock today. He will face the absolute maximum federal prison sentence the law allows. I am done protecting him." Before my index finger could press the first digit of our internal dialing code on the keypad, Gregory reached across the wide desk and firmly clamped his large, heavy hand down over the top of the brass receiver, pressing it hard against the cradle. "To prove what they are staging before they execute it, we cannot rely on circumstantial wire receipts," Gregory said grimly. Derek could claim in a courtroom that he was simply investing in Dr. Thorne's new private clinic or assisting a sick friend. We needed the raw, undeniable communication trails. We needed to step outside standard legal auditing protocols immediately. At exactly 3 o'clock that afternoon, the sliding panels of my private executive elevator parted once more, and a man introduced simply as Vance stepped onto the 44th floor. Vance did not look like a corporate employee. He wore no suit, carried a battered, reinforced black nylon backpack, and possessed an unsettling, completely silent demeanor that allowed him to blend into the shadows of any room he entered. Gregory informed me that Vance was a former federal cybersecurity intelligence analyst who now operated exclusively in the highly lucrative, morally gray private sector of corporate espionage and digital asset recovery. Vance asked absolutely no questions. He walked straight to the long glass conference table in my office, pulled out a high-powered, heavily encrypted laptop, attached a series of complex routing hubs directly into our wall terminals, and began his work. For 6 grueling, agonizing hours, Gregory and I sat in total silence in the darkening executive suite, watching the golden afternoon sun dip below the jagged Manhattan skyline, painting the office in deep, stretching shadows. The only sound in the room was the rapid, continuous, rhythmic clicking of Vance's fingers flying across his mechanical keyboard. I poured a glass of ice water and sat in my wingback chair, my mind torturing itself with 1,000 horrific reflections. I thought about Monica, how she smiled so warmly and played the sweet, devoted daughter-in-law at every single Thanksgiving dinner while secretly plotting my absolute destruction. I thought about Patricia, lounging in that center VIP booth at Prime Steakhouse with her diamond rings, sipping expensive French champagne purchased with the very dollars she was using to purchase my demise. And above all, I thought about Derek, the boy I had taught to ride a bicycle across our suburban lawn, the young man whose college diploma I had framed with tears of pride in my eyes. At precisely 9:15 that evening, the rapid typing suddenly ceased. Vance leaned back in his chair, rubbing his strained eyes with his palms. He looked across at Gregory, gave a short, sharp nod, and then turned his gaze toward me. "I am in," Vance announced, his voice flat and mechanical. I successfully bypassed the secondary firewalls and cracked the multi-layer encryption vault Derek uses to communicate over external servers with Patricia and Dr. Eris Thorne. I extracted a complete, uncorrupted local cache containing exactly 53 email chains, encrypted instant messages, and 4 attached PDF dossiers. With a quick keystroke, Vance mirrored his laptop display directly onto the 60-inch presentation monitor mounted across my office wall. The digital evidence illuminated the darkened room with a harsh, glaring white light that made my eyes ache. Gregory and I stood up immediately and stepped close to the screen, reading through the chronological log of messages. To any casual internal observer, the subject lines appeared entirely innocuous, labeled with corporate headers such as West Side Architectural Consultations, Estate Planning Amendments, and Quarterly Trust Updates. But when Vance clicked into the underlying text bodies, the sheer, breathtaking malice of the conspiracy was laid entirely bare. We read through the earliest email chain, initiated by Patricia nearly 3 months ago. She was explicitly instructing Derek on exactly how to approach Dr. Thorne with their corrupt financial proposition. Patricia wrote that, through her elite Wilmington social contacts, she had discovered that Dr. Thorne was drowning in massive, unpublicized offshore gambling debts and was desperate for untraceable liquidity to prevent a scandal. The subsequent emails documented a chilling, meticulous negotiation between my son and the doctor. Derek offered an immediate $50,000 cash advance, funneled cleanly through the Lumina Design Shell Company, paired with a binding promise of an additional $200,000 disbursement, the exact instant their primary objective was legally finalized. And then, Vance clicked open the first of the encrypted PDF attachments. It was a comprehensive, highly detailed medical dossier. My full legal name, Harrison Blake, my date of birth, and my private Social Security identification numbers were stamped boldly across the top header of the first page. I stood paralyzed before the monitor, reading through the diagnostic summary in absolute, cold-blooded horror. The document was a flawlessly fabricated, exhaustive psychiatric and neurological evaluation. According to the dense clinical terminology, brain scan summaries, and behavioral observations detailed across the pages, I had been suffering from severe, rapidly accelerating cognitive decline for over 14 months. The report described fictional episodes of severe, aggressive behavioral outbursts in the executive suite, profound short-term memory loss, and a complete, irreversible inability to comprehend complex financial concepts or manage personal assets. At the bottom of the final page, bearing his official medical license number and stamped with his professional corporate seal, Dr. Eris Thorne had formally and legally diagnosed me with aggressive, early-onset Alzheimer's disease, explicitly declaring me entirely unfit and incompetent to manage my company, my finances, or my own daily existence. The sheer, suffocating cruelty of the document stole the breath directly from my lungs. The $800,000 in embezzled vendor fees was nothing compared to this. They did not just want my bank accounts. They wanted to legally strip away my human autonomy, erase my identity, and reduce me to a medically condemned prisoner within my own life. Gregory scrolled down to the most recent email in the chain, sent just 2 days prior by Monica. She was writing to confirm the physical receipt of the fully signed and sealed medical dossier from Dr. Thorne's courier. Her message was brief, cold, and dripping with triumphant malice. My longtime executive secretary, a brilliant woman named Sarah, who had managed my schedule with immaculate precision for over 20 years, looked up from her desk with her usual warm, professional greeting as I stepped out of the elevator. I paused directly in front of her workstation, letting my shoulders slump forward as I stared blankly at the polished brass nameplate resting beside her keyboard. I allowed a long, uncomfortable 10-second silence to stretch out between us, narrowing my eyes and squinting as if desperately struggling to grasp a slipping memory. "Good morning, Susan," I said, deliberately using the wrong name as I looked her in the eye. Have you seen the quarterly regional revenue projections from our Chicago division?" I cannot seem to find where I put the binder. Sarah blinked in genuine, startled confusion, her smile wavering slightly as she looked at me. In 20 years, I had never once forgotten or misspoken her name. "It is Sarah, Mr. Blake," she gently corrected me, her brow furrowing with quiet concern as she handed over the blue leather binder from her outbox. "And the Chicago figures were placed right on the center of your desk on Friday afternoon." "Sir." "Ah, right. Of course they were, Susan. Thank you," I muttered vaguely, shaking my head with a weary sigh before shuffling slowly into my office and leaving the door half open behind me. It was a minor, seemingly harmless slip, but in the highly pressurized, hyper-observant ecosystem of Blake Holdings executive headquarters, rumors of executive vulnerability traveled faster than electricity through copper wire. By lunchtime, I knew through Vance's audio intercepts that Sarah had quietly expressed concern to 2 senior vice presidents, and that Derek had already caught wind of the incident. I spent the entire afternoon systematically dismantling 40 years of immaculate professional reputation. During a high-level corporate strategy meeting with our 5 regional managing directors in the glass boardroom, I sat at the head of the table, hunched over my notepad, staring blankly at the projected revenue charts illuminated on the presentation screen. When Derek stood up at the opposite end of the table to present his carefully curated budget figures for the upcoming fiscal quarter, I raised my trembling hand and interrupted him mid-sentence. "Hold on, Derek," I rasped, rubbing my temples with trembling fingers. "Go back to the operating costs for the West Side parcel. Repeat those numbers for me again. I cannot seem to follow the math today. Why are our concrete expenditures doubling?" I had already asked him to explain those exact concrete allocations twice during the first 10 minutes of the meeting. I watched the 5 regional directors exchange quick, nervous, darting glances across the table, their faces tight with quiet alarm. Derek, however, handled my staged interruption with masterful, poisonous grace. A subtle, predatory gleam flashed across his eyes before he smoothly smoothed his features into an expression of infinite, patronizing patience. He walked slowly around the long glass table, came to my side, and placed a warm, condescending hand on my shoulder, speaking to me in the slow, loud, carefully articulated tone one might reserve for a confused toddler or a dementia patient. "It is all right, Dad," Derek said softly, ensuring every director in the room heard his touching filial devotion. "The concrete expenditures are not doubling; those are the foundational reinforcement numbers we approved during last month's review. Remember? You are just looking at the aggregate column instead of the quarterly breakdown. Let me walk you through the logic one more time so you do not have to stress over the details." "Ah, yes, I see it now, son," I mumbled, offering a weak, defeated nod as I sank lower into my chair, playing the part of the weary patriarch surrendering to the fog of age. "Thank you for being so patient with me. My head is just not quite working right today." The trap was not merely about staging public displays of cognitive failure before the board members. I needed to cultivate an internal operational environment where Derek felt so completely secure and superior that he completely dropped his remaining security protocols, confident that the blind old man in the corner suite was far too confused to notice what was happening right under his nose. With the foundational stage of my apparent cognitive collapse firmly established across the executive suites, it was time to deploy the final, lethal phase of our strategy before the board convened. I needed a mechanism that would not merely expose Derek as a corporate embezzler and a medical conspirator, but would completely, independently, and permanently crush his financial solvency forever, isolating him from our corporate assets while leaving him legally chained to an inescapable mountain of ruin. On Friday morning, just 72 hours before the scheduled annual board meeting, I instructed Sarah to keep the heavy velvet blinds in my office drawn tightly shut, bathing the executive suite in dim, somber shadows. I unbuttoned my collar, loosened my tie until it hung askew, and placed 3 generic orange prescription pill bottles right on the front corner of my mahogany desk, exactly where anyone sitting in the guest armchair would immediately spot them. At 10 o'clock sharp, I pressed my intercom and requested that the vice president step into my office right away for a private, urgent briefing. Derek arrived less than 2 minutes later. He pushed the oak door open softly, wearing a practiced, carefully calibrated expression of gentle, filial concern. His eyes swept the darkened room, locked onto the orange prescription bottles on the corner of my desk for a brief, triumphant second, and then shifted to my slumped, seemingly exhausted posture. He approached the desk with light, cautious steps, like a hunter stepping toward a dying stag. "You called for me, Dad?" Derek asked softly, dropping heavily into the leather armchair across from me. "Sarah mentioned you sounded quite tired over the intercom. Are you feeling all right today?" I let out a long, shuddering, theatrical breath from the bottom of my lungs, slumping even lower into my high-backed chair and rubbing my temples with trembling fingers. I looked across at him with glassy, unfocused eyes, projecting the tragic, heartbreaking aura of an old patriarch who has finally accepted that his mind is unraveling. "Then what do we do, Patricia?" Derek asked nervously, his natural cowardice surfacing. "How on earth do I close a $15 million commercial land acquisition by Friday, without Blake Holdings guaranteeing the institutional credit?" Patricia laughed, a harsh, dismissive sound that echoed through my study. "You cut Blake Holdings out of the equation entirely, you idiot! We take 100% of this property for ourselves, right now, so we never have to share a single dime of the profit with those board members. And so we keep our internal books completely sealed from corporate auditors. And how do I guarantee a $15 million loan on my own?" Derek stammered. "By leveraging what we already own," Patricia declared triumphantly. "First, you immediately take out a high-interest, short-term private commercial mortgage against your unencumbered residential estate. That magnificent, paid-off mansion Harrison's bought you in cash on your wedding day. That secures the initial cash liquidity for the down payment. Second, you leverage Lumina Design. Because Lumina Design has been receiving $80,000 a month in steady consulting disbursements from Blake Holdings over the past year, it appears on paper as a highly profitable, cash-rich corporate enterprise. You list Lumina Design LLC as the primary corporate cross-guarantor for the remaining balance of the $15 million acquisition loan. Patricia outlined her catastrophic, reckless strategy with glowing pride. By combining the multi-million-dollar equity of your mansion with the paper solvency of Lumina Design, the private commercial lenders will approve the $15 million acquisition loan independently. We bypass Harrison's corporate guarantees entirely. We keep the Blake Holdings board of directors completely blind to the transaction, and when the retail complex breaks ground, every single dollar of that $40 million profit belongs exclusively to us and Lumina Design." Gregory opened the red government folder and slid a heavily redacted, highly classified geological survey directly across the table. It was an official Environmental Protection Agency, EPA, Federal Geological and Soil Contamination Survey. To the untrained eye of an arrogant amateur like your son, that 15-acre suburban property looked like an absolute retail gold mine on the surface, Gregory said, a tight, merciless smile touching the corners of his mouth. "It is situated near major highway arteries and surrounded by wealthy suburban subdivisions. But because Derek was so blinded by his greed and so frantic to close the acquisition before the board meeting today, he never bothered to commission an independent soil core analysis or run a basic Phase 2 environmental engineering audit. He relied entirely on the outdated, superficial marketing survey that was included in the prospectus, a survey that conveniently omitted the true, 60-year history of that land." Gregory tapped his index finger hard against a highlighted paragraph on the federal document. During the late 1950s, long before modern environmental protection regulations or corporate oversight laws were enacted, that 15-acre suburban parcel was the primary operational site for an unregulated, industrial chemical manufacturing and solvent refining plant. Over a 12-year period, the factory operators systematically dumped tens of thousands of gallons of heavy industrial metals, volatile organic solvents, carcinogenic chlorinated hydrocarbons, and toxic chemical waste directly into the unlined soil trenches across the property. When the factory closed in 1970, the owners simply bulldozed the concrete structures, brought in 4 feet of clean topsoil, and paved over the site, burying the toxic chemical plume deep below the ground. I stared down at the chemical breakdown listed on the EPA chart. What is the exact current legal status of that parcel with the federal government today? Gregory? 3 weeks ago, Gregory stated with absolute, ringing finality. The Environmental Protection Agency completed a 2-year subsurface hydrological testing protocol and formally classified that entire 15-acre parcel as an active, mandatory federal Superfund toxic waste cleanup site. The toxic chemical plume has breached the clay substrate and has begun actively migrating toward the regional municipal water table. The federal government has issued an immediate emergency environmental remediation mandate. The land is completely unbuildable, permanently condemned, entirely toxic, and absolutely worthless. However, Derek continued, looking slowly around the table, making direct, mournful eye contact with our senior investment partners. The greatest, most painful act of love and loyalty a son can ever perform is recognizing the heartbreaking moment when his hero can no longer fight his own battles against the ravages of time. Over the past 12 months, and with terrifying, undeniable acceleration over the last 30 days, our executive team and our family have witnessed a severe, progressive, and catastrophic decline in my father's cognitive and neurological faculties. A low, concerned murmur rippled down both sides of the 30-foot oak table. Directors leaned forward in their chairs, staring at me as I kept my gaze bowed toward my lap. We have all observed the painful symptoms right here in our executive suites, Derek said, his voice cracking with a perfectly timed emotional sob. We have seen the profound short-term memory lapses, the inability to track basic quarterly revenue calculations, the sudden confusion over long-standing corporate partnerships, and the severe, unprovoked behavioral disorientation during regional briefings. For months, I have worked tirelessly behind the scenes, shouldering 90% of our daily operational burdens and quietly masking these lapses because I desperately wanted to protect my father's public dignity and shield his magnificent legacy from embarrassment. Derek reached down into his tailored leather briefcase and lifted out a thick, sealed manila envelope. With a sharp, dramatic pull that echoed loudly across the silent room, he tore the seal open, withdrew a dense stack of certified medical and legal documents, and laid them firmly onto the polished wood of the table. Last week, recognizing that the situation had reached a critical operational crisis, I successfully persuaded my father to undergo a comprehensive, independent neurological and psychiatric evaluation conducted by one of the most prestigious, highly respected private diagnostic specialists in Manhattan, Derek announced solemnly. The clinical findings are absolutely devastating. Derek turned to his legal counsel and nodded sharply. The attorneys immediately distributed bound, certified copies of the medical dossier down both sides of the table, placing a packet directly in front of every senior director. Gregory stepped forward, placing his hands firmly on the back of a chair. Respected directors, allow me to introduce Dr. Eris Thorne, the private neurologist whose signature is stamped on the medical dossier sitting in front of you. Dr. Thorne is present in our boardroom this morning under an active, federally mandated cooperation and plea agreement executed with the United States Department of Justice and the United States Attorney's Office exactly 48 hours ago. Gregory pointed a sharp finger at the medical files on the table. Over the weekend, our private cybersecurity forensics team, acting in coordination with the White-Collar Crimes Division of the FBI, intercepted and decrypted an extensive, multi-layer communication vault connecting Derek Blake, his mother-in-law Patricia, and Dr. Thorne. Those decrypted logs provided undeniable, definitive proof that the Alzheimer's medical dossier sitting on this table right now is an absolute, complete 100% criminal forgery. The boardroom erupted into stunned, explosive gasps. Senior directors snatched up the medical files, staring at the pages in horror as Gregory laid out the raw facts with surgical precision. Dr. Thorne never once conducted a neurological evaluation, a cognitive assessment, or a brain scan on Harrison Blake, Gregory declared to the room. Instead, Dr. Thorne accepted a direct, illegal $50 in wire transfer bribe funneled out of a fraudulent Delaware shell company controlled by Derek and Patricia, along with a binding contract promising an additional $200,000 upon the successful execution of this boardroom coup. Faced with 20 years in a federal penitentiary for medical fraud, perjury, and felony conspiracy, Dr. Thorne signed a comprehensive federal confession. On Saturday afternoon, Dr. Thorne wore a concealed federal recording wire during his final planning meeting with Patricia, capturing dozens of hours of crystal-clear audio admissions detailing this exact medical proxy conspiracy. Derek stood completely frozen at the end of the oak table, gripping the wood with white knuckles, his mouth opening and closing soundlessly like a suffocating fish. The carefully crafted illusion of the dutiful, heartbroken son shattered into a million pieces, exposing the terrified, cornered, desperate criminal hiding beneath the suit. One of the tall FBI financial crime agents stepped forward, his badge gleaming under the lights, his voice a flat, uncompromising, professional monotone that cut straight through the shocked murmurs of our directors. "Members of the board," the federal agent announced firmly, addressing the room. "The Federal Bureau of Investigation, in coordination with the United States Department of Justice, has been conducting an intensive, comprehensive financial crimes investigation into an active corporate embezzlement and money laundering ring operating right here on the 44th floor of Blake Holdings, under the direct authorization of your Executive Vice President, Derek Blake." Derek slid right out of the grip of the federal agent standing beside him, falling heavily onto his knees right there, on the polished hardwood floor of our boardroom, his steel handcuffs clanking loudly against the wood. The arrogant, boastful heir apparent, the man who had confidently swiped my corporate card at the steakhouse and plotted to lock me away inside a secure psychiatric facility, was now physically crawling across the floorboards on his knees toward my shoes. "Dad, please," Derek screamed out, crying in raw, agonizing, suffocating panic as his tears dripped onto the Persian runner. "Dad, I beg of you, help me. Don't do this to me. Use the corporate liquidity of Blake Holdings to pay off the private lending syndicate. Use our corporate legal reserves to settle the $15 million superfund, fine with the EPA. Save my house, save my wife. I am your son, Dad. I am your only flesh and blood. You have to protect me, because we are family." I looked down from my standing position at the head of the table at the 36-year-old man kneeling in chains at my feet. I felt an internal detachment so profound, so absolute, and so complete that it felt as though I were observing a strange, pathetic insect crawling across the street. "Family," I repeated softly, my voice quiet yet echoing into every corner of the silent boardroom. "You forfeited the right to utter the word family to me the exact moment you sat down with that corrupt doctor and actively conspired to erase my existence, my sanity, and my freedom for money." Patricia began to scream in raw, unfiltered, hysterical terror from the doorway, dropping her crystal flutes onto the floor, where they shattered into 100 pieces among the spilled champagne. "No, I am a respected aristocrat from Wilmington. I am a woman of high society. You cannot do this to me. I cannot go to a federal prison. My reputation will be permanently destroyed." One of the tall FBI white-collar agents stepped forward calmly around the table, reaching into his interior suit pocket and pulling out a secondary, certified federal arrest warrant, bearing Patricia's full legal name. I was a 70-year-old man, entirely single, standing alone inside the master corner suite of an $800 million corporate fortress. I had just permanently lost my only son to an incurable, terminal rot of the human soul called greed. A lesser, weaker man might have collapsed under the staggering, heartbreaking emotional weight of that reality. A lesser man might have wept into his hands, mourning the shattered illusion of a loving family or agonizing over the empty holidays that lay ahead. Yet, standing there bathing in the warm sunlight on the 44th floor, looking out over the magnificent city I had conquered, from the seat of a rusted pickup truck 4 decades ago, I felt absolutely zero sorrow. I felt no lingering traces of grief, no doubt, and not a single drop of parental regret. I had surgically, precisely excised a malignant, spreading parasitic cancer from my daily existence before it could completely consume and destroy my hard-earned life's work. I had protected the sprawling enterprise and the hundreds of employees I loved, and above all, I had successfully reclaimed total, absolute, undeniable sovereignty over my own peace and my own destiny. The air inside my office finally felt clean, crisp, and entirely breathable once again. I took another slow sip of the rich bourbon, savoring the magnificent, unmistakable, sweet taste of absolute victory. My grand corporate legacy was finally completely secure, perfectly and permanently insulated from the treacherous leeches who had plotted in the dark to drain it dry. I knew with absolute certainty that the coming days and weeks would bring countless loud, gossiping whispers across the exclusive country clubs, boardrooms, and high society dining halls of the city. Let them whisper. Those ignorant, chattering voices meant absolutely nothing to me anymore. I had survived the absolute worst, most monstrous betrayal imaginable from the people who owed me everything, and I had proudly emerged from the fire sharper, infinitely stronger, and completely victorious against every odds. Blood does not guarantee human loyalty, and sharing a family last name is never an excuse to tolerate disrespect, manipulation, or treachery. We spend our entire lives working, sweating, and sacrificing to construct a secure foundation for our children, desperately hoping they will inherit our personal ethics, our grit, and our moral compass, along with our financial wealth. But when toxic greed completely poisons their hearts, when they begin looking at your generosity as weakness and viewing your life as an obstacle to their inheritance, you must have the courage, the strength, and the self-respect to stop acting as their safety net. True, profound love sometimes means stepping back, pulling away the cushions, and allowing them to fall straight into the terrible, crushing, inescapable consequences of their own devastating actions. Protect your peace with an iron fist, defend your hard-earned legacy against every predator, even if they sit at your own dinner table. And never allow anyone, no matter who they are, no matter how much you have loved them, and no matter what title they carry, to mistake your fatherly generosity for foolish vulnerability. You owe yourself the absolute dignity, the sovereignty, and the self-respect that they selfishly denied you.